Hello everyone and welcome back. In this lecture, we'll be discussing Django with static files, and we'll learn how to insert static media files. So far, we've used templates and template tagging to insert just simple text. But we don't always just want text. What about other types of media? For example, returning a user's photo. Let's go ahead and discuss static media files. We're not yet at the point where we can connect to a database, grab a user's photo, and then insert it, but we are at a point where we can just grab a static media file and serve it to whoever happens to visit the page. To do this, we're going to create a new directory inside of the project called static, just like we did for templates. Then, we're going to add this directory path to the project settings.py file. Then we will also add a static URL variable. Very similar process to what we did with templates. Once we've done all that, we need a place to store our static image files. So, underneath the static directory, we'll go ahead and make a new directory called images. And you can go ahead and place a favorite JPEG file inside this images directory, or just download one off the internet. Then to test that this all worked, once we've set it up, we should be able to go to a URL that looks like this. It'll be your domain, /static/images, and you should be able to pick up whatever picture you happen to save there. And that will allow us to confirm that the paths are set up and connected properly. But what we really want to do is set up a template tag for this. So that line right there shows us that we have everything connected, but then we're going to learn how to actually inject that static media image using template tags. And to do this inside an HTML file, we need to add in a few specific tags. So at the top of that HTML file, we're going to add this load static files, which basically tells Django to load up the static files. But keep in mind, this line right here is going to go after that doc-type HTML line. So that doc-type HTML that's automatically created when we create an HTML file, make sure that always goes at the top, otherwise you may get errors. And we'll walk you through this when we actually code this out. Then what we're going to also do is insert the image with an HTML image source. So as you remember from the HTML lectures, when we're actually inserting an image into HTML, we use this image tag. But in this case, for the source, we're not going to provide a file path. Instead, we're going to use template tags to actually inject static and then call the part of the file path we need. In this case, it'll just be images pic.jpg, or whatever your picture happens to be called. And this will all make a lot more sense when we actually code this out. Now, a quick thing to notice is how this template tag, those curly bracket %, is a little different than the double set of curly brackets. We're going to be discussing and showing these differences more clearly in future lectures, but for right now, just consider those double curly brackets as being used for simple text injection. And we can actually use these curly bracket %, template tags for a lot more complex injections and actual logic. Later on, you'll see how we can actually write a for loop using those template tags inside our HTML file. Okay, let's code through an example of serving up a static image, and afterwards we can dive into models and databases by moving on to Django Level 2. I'm going to jump to the Atom text editor to get started. Alright, so here I am at the Atom text editor. The first thing I want to do is, just like we did with templates, I'm going to create a new folder called static. So I will right-click the top-level directory of first project, click new folder or new directory, call it static, and then inside of this static I'm going to do another folder and then call it something like images. And now we have the directory first project static images, really similar to what we did for the templates first app. Let me collapse some of these things. Alright, the next thing we have to do is tell Django where to actually find static images. In this case, we edit the settings.py file just like we did with templates, so really similar process here. And then just like we did with templates, we're going to use the os.path.join, but we'll add a little more to it. In this case, we will create a new variable and call it something like static underscore dir for the directory for the static, and then we will say os.path.join. And I'm going to join that base directory just like we did last time with the string static. So that leads just to this static folder here. And then later on, we can call images when we're actually dealing with our template tags. So this basically provides that absolute path to the location of that static folder inside of our project. Alright, so the next step is to scroll all the way down in your settings.py file And you should notice something that mentions static files right here. And it also has a really nice link to the documentation on how to actually set up static files. And you see that we already have basically a pre-built variable, static URL, leading to static. And that just allows you to use that for convenience. But what we want to do is add in another variable that will actually be able to take in a list of static file directory paths. And basically the reason for this is when you're dealing with your own applications and your own projects, for this static folder, you may not want something so simple as just static images. You may actually want to take the approach we did with templates and have each application have its own special folder, and then within that folder put in your images. So this may have been static first app images. So just to keep that in mind, let's show you how you can actually create a variable that will be the static files directory. So we'll do something like static files, all caps, underscore DIRS. So static file directories is equal to, and then this is going to be a list. And here is where we're going to pass in that variable we made earlier. If we scroll all the way back to the top, or close to the top, this static directory, which is just joining the base directory of that static folder. So coming all the way back down, we will pass in here static directory. And we can put a comma there to make sure that works with the multiple lines. As a quick note, you should always check to make sure that this static files underscore DIRS variable doesn't already exist. Sometimes some boilerplate code will already have it placed there for you, so you'll want to check. And it's possible that in future versions of Django, they will actually create this as an empty list to begin with when you generate a new project. So keep that in mind. You should always check to make sure you're not overwriting a variable or double defining it. Otherwise, you're going to get confused, and Django will also get confused. So let's keep on going. The next thing I want to do is to actually place some sort of JPEG file inside of this images folder. So I'm going to do that. I'll do that through just Windows Explorer, or if you're on a Mac, do that with Finder. So let me jump to doing that. Alright, so I just did that through the Finder. You weren't able to see it because I was doing it on another monitor, but as a quick little note, if I bring in my browser here, I just downloaded this picture of Django. This is the actual guitarist that Django is named after, Django Reinhardt, and then I put it into the images. So go ahead and put in whatever JPEG file you want there, and I'll just put in Django for that. Okay, let's go ahead and continue. And with everything we have now, we should be able to actually test out and run the server. Before we do, I just want to quickly review what these three variables we created are in the settings.py file. So scrolling back up here, this static directory is just using the Python OS module to actually join the base directory to static. And then scrolling all the way down to the very bottom, we have the static file variables. We have static underscore URL. And if you're using an older version of Django, make sure you manually place that in. 1.9 and above should have done this automatically for you. And you want to make sure you have the forward slashes both at the beginning and the end of that string. So definitely scroll all the way down and make sure that's already been placed for you. If not, go ahead and copy this, static underscore URL equals that string of static. And then we have the static files underscore DIRS and that list. And basically what's happening is the two variables that we created, static dir and static files underscore dir, refer to locations on this computer where static files are being stored. And then that final variable that was already here, that static underscore URL, is just going to allow us to specify the URL with which static files can be accessed when we're actually running our Django server. So for example, when you're actually running the server, someone could go to your domain name /static/ and get access to static content if they're on the client side. And later on we can add protections to make sure not everyone can just go and grab static content. But let's just test this and make sure everything's working out. I can do that just by saying Python. Actually, let's cd into first project first. And now I say Python manage.py run server, hit enter, and it looks like it's running. Like I've done before, I will just copy this and bring it in my browser. So bringing in my browser, I can see here the previous stuff we've worked on for the first project. Hello, this is index.html, and now I'm coming from first app index. But what I want to do now is actually get to that static image. So I will say this, static images slash, and then type in Django guitar.jpg, or whatever your JPEG file happens to be named. And here we have it, the picture of Django. And now what we want to do is actually use template tagging to inject this image into an HTML file. So as a user, you're not going to be directly sifting through the static images just to find a JPEG. What we want to do is show this as if it was just a normal HTML page that happened to have this image injected into it. So let's work on doing that. So coming back to our templates page over here, we have our first app, and then we have that index HTML. So now let's call this something like Django guitar page. Save that, and then I will say, hi, this is a picture of Django himself. And then we want to actually use template tagging for the injection or inserting that actual material. So I'm going to delete this insert me. Remember that was from the previous view that we were working with earlier. And below this doc type HTML, I want to load static files. And that basically allows Django to know, hey, we need to load some static files here. And that will save you time if you don't need to load static files. That way you're not just always loading them. So we'll say load static files. Okay, and again, notice the different type of template tagging I'm using here. So as a quick note, I mentioned this in the presentation, but you always want to make sure that the very first line is this one, doc type HTML. Otherwise, the HTML code is going to get confused. Then the next thing we want to do is to actually put in an image tag that will have the picture of Django. So let's do that. We have an image, and the source we want to do is where we use the template tagging again. So typically, what we were doing in the HTML section of the course is we were actually just hard coding the path in there. But now, since we're using Django, we can actually use template tagging to essentially inject the image. So I'm going to say, okay, this is static. And then as a string, I'm going to say it's under images slash, and my one is called Django guitar.jpg. That's what my file is called. And then finally I want to close that off. And you may want to have something like an alternative here. That's what ALT stands for. So in case for some reason you're not able to load that JPEG, it's always a good idea to have some sort of alternative there. So we can say like something like, uh-oh, didn't show. So that way we can see at least something to know we accidentally weren't able to link this correctly. So it's always a good idea to have an alternative there. Now let's check in back with our server and make sure this actually all worked. I'm going to grab my browser again, and I will bring it over. And notice right now my file path is at static images Django guitar.jpg. If I delete all of this and go back to my home page, that index page, hit enter, here I have the actual view I was doing. Bring that guy back up. And here he is, just on the index page. It says, hi, this is a picture of Django himself, and we were able to actually inject that image there. So that's static file. And as another quick note, I know I've been talking a lot about injecting static images, but static files don't just have to be images. They can actually be basically any static file that's not going to change. And that includes things like CSS and JavaScript. So those can be two files that are underneath your static folder that aren't going to change. And let me show you an example of what that would actually look like. So I'm going to exit this, and under static, let's make a new folder and call it something like CSS. And I'm going to make a new file here and call it, I don't know, my style.css. And here let's just give a quick style tag to header1, that way we know it's actually working. Which means I'm going to say something like h1 for header1, and then let's just make it obvious. We will put the color here as something like red. And then I'm going to save this. So here I have my style.css. It's inside my static folder, so static css my style.css. And hopefully you can begin to get an idea of the power of templates, right? Like I mentioned earlier, they're a skeleton or scaffolding, and you're going to inject stuff. And because it's a skeleton or scaffolding, you can reuse them over and over again and just change things slightly depending on the situation. And you can call different static files into them. But right now I have that CSS. So let's go back to that index.html under templates and show you how you can actually now call template tagging to insert the static file that's not an image, but an actual CSS file. Which means back up here in the head of the HTML document, I want to make sure I've already loaded static files, and then I'm going to create a link, and it will be a style sheet with the href. And in this case, I'm going to remove this string and replace it with some template tags. And I'm going to be using the %sign because I'm not just injecting simple text. And then I call static, and then pass in the string of where that CSS is actually based inside of that static folder. So underneath static directory, I have the CSS directory, and then underneath that, I want to call mystyle.css. And let's close off that tag and make sure it's all working. And as a quick note, this should also be wrapped as a string, which is why I wasn't looking correct earlier. Whoops. Okay, so I have a string within a string. So these little tags here, have those ready to go. Then we have static, and we have this string inside of that. Let's save this and restart our server to make sure it's actually picking up on that style. So I'm going to bring back in that browser. And if I bring it back in, we should see that the header has now turned red. And that's the case. Hi, this is a picture of Django himself, and we're actually connecting now a static CSS file. Perfect. So we've learned a lot of the power of static files and being able to inject them with template tags. So kind of a 2-for-1 here. How to use template tags that actually perform some sort of logic or inject something that's not just simple text, and then also how to deal with static images and static files. Alright, so hopefully out of this lecture, you're really beginning to understand the sort of workflow that develops with Django. That you're creating a project, creating applications, linking views to URLs, dealing with the settings file in the way you need to, and then more than just injecting a simple static image, actually linking static using template tags into whatever HTML files you're working with. So hopefully you get an idea of the sort of workflow we're going to be developing as we move on to larger and larger projects. All right, that is it for Django Level 1. Coming up in Django Level 2, we're going to learn about this basically third piece of the puzzle, which is models and databases. So a lot of times Django is known as an MTV framework with models, templates, and views. And so far we've only learned about templates and views. It's time to get in that third puzzle piece with models and connect everything here to an actual database. All right, thanks everyone, and I will see you at the next lecture.